Welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show presented by GBG Plc. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. Over the 4 years, we've hosted these weekly conversations with people across all sectors of the business of sports betting and gaming. One man has eluded our invitations to be our guest here. To make it clear, we say that with tongue lodged firmly in cheek. But we've tried our darndest to get this guy in the podcast because of his vast and impressive resume in the gambling space. And finally, we've succeeded and have done so as he has just embarked on his newest venture. Finally, please welcome to the Gaming News Canada show, Ilkim Hincer. Hey, Ilkim, finally, it's great to finally get you here on this platform with me.
Oh, hi, Steve. It's great to finally actually sit across from you, or virtually sit across from you. It's been long overdue, and my apologies for appearing to bounce from place to place, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, solely for the purpose of not having this conversation with you on the podcast. Obviously, tongue firmly in cheek as well.
Well, listen, you've been, I'm talking about 4 years of doing Gaming News Canada and the podcast. I mean, you've been a busy guy in the industry over those 4 years with several roles, but the one, and again, it's always great when we can have breaking news of some sort on the podcast. And that was the announcement at the end of February that you were the new chief legal officer for GeoComply. And I'm sure, like any move, there's a great backstory behind how this came about.
Thanks, Steve. It's an interesting time, certainly interesting time in the world, interesting time in gaming, interesting time in world geopolitics as well, as we can all appreciate. An interesting time in my personal and professional life and development. I've known GeoComply for some time. GeoComply, as I think most of your listeners will know, has been a part of the fabric of the gaming universe, certainly the online gaming universe, for many years. It was launched in 2011 by Anna Sansbury and David Briggs. And back then, I had already spent a few years at the BC Lottery Corporation, based out of Vancouver, and Kamloops. As a side note, that was my foray into gaming. Now it's been just over 20 years, almost exactly 20 years plus. And when GeoComply came on the scene, I would have met, and I did spend some time with Anna and David at various industry events, typically held in Vancouver, just to say hello and talk about the industry in general. And over the years, of course, as I've gone from one thing to the next thing, I've been very proud to follow the evolution of GeoComply and its success. And when I, flash forwarding a little bit here, when I joined the CGA board itself a few years later, by that point, GeoComply had become a tremendous success in this space. And it is for those of you who don't know GeoComply, for the listeners, it's an online anti-fraud solution. Its motto is to instill confidence in every online transaction, and it was instrumental in the launch of online sports betting after PASPA fell in 2018. And I was very proud at every given opportunity to be able to say to folks, this is a Canadian success story that began in Vancouver, and obviously being in the tech space and the gaming space and the gaming adjacent space, it was always a tremendous opportunity to tout the skills that we have in Canada and the abilities that we can export to the rest of the world. And of course, I've always enjoyed helping shape the architecture of gaming itself to the extent that I can do that. That's a very engaging exercise for me. And GeoComply certainly has been able to do that over the years. And to make a very long story short, I would occasionally run into GeoComply, Anna and David and others. I got to know Lindsay Slater a little bit. As you know, she's an SVP of compliance and other matters at GeoComply, and she's still very much involved, and she's on the board of the CGA now. as well, a big asset to the gaming industry in Canada and beyond. And late last year, I was looking at several opportunities for the next adventure for Ilkim to get into. As you know, I'm probably a bit of a poster child for uh, for moving on and hopefully accretively building on my career and the impact that I'm able to have on the gaming industry. And I'm fortunate enough to have made a number of contacts in this industry, and my network and the conversations that I was having with a number of people led me to consider a number of things very actively at the end of last year. And one of the most interesting things was GeoComply. I started having conversations with Anna, and then with David, and then collectively about wouldn't it be amazing if we could start figuring out a way to work together. And this was a very tail end of 2024, late November, early December. And ultimately, I certainly got very excited about the conversations. I think the vision that Anna and David have and GeoComply has for its own future and for the industry's future very much aligned with mine and our philosophies of how to get that done and how to accomplish a number of things. And we had some robust chats about some emerging activities, emerging topics in the gaming industry. As you know, better than anyone, it's constantly changing, constantly evolving. The only constant is change, as they say, as cliched as that sounds. And GeoComply certainly is a very nimble company, and it moves at a very fast clip, and it's able to, I think, pivot to new ways of doing things. It's a huge champion of innovation, and I like to think that I can make a valuable addition to that kind of philosophy, that kind of thinking. And we started talking, as like I said, as late as the very last few weeks of 2024. And then I, along with my family, went on a little mini vacation on a cruise, which I wouldn't recommend doing with two 5-year-olds to most people after having done that for 8 days. That's a separate side story. But we started finalizing the details while I was on that cruise and got horribly sick, by the way, as a side note as well. And ultimately, we made it work, and we decided that GeoComply and Ilkim's paths were going to unite, and we were going to hopefully do some wonderful things together.
Hey, Ilkim, I want to talk about those emerging topics in a second, and hopefully you can shed a little bit more light on that. But I'm really glad you brought up GeoComply's Canadian roots, and what you were talking reminded me, and it's even more relevant in these crazy geopolitical times that we live in, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And GeoComply was a leader back when Russia first invaded Ukraine and bringing workers from Ukraine to work in Toronto. And I remember, probably 2 years ago now, I think, where they opened their new offices in downtown Toronto. So this is a company, even though it seems to have, obviously has a very strong business in the U.S., is a BC born country, and has done a lot of good things with the business in Canada.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up as well. And I have, since joining only a couple of weeks ago, I've learned even more of the kinds of things that the company has done. And I am currently, as we record this, I'm in the Toronto office, and the Toronto office has just moved within downtown Toronto. And a good contingent of the Toronto office is made up of former or folks who were formerly resident in Ukraine. And GeoComply has had a history of being very much involved in the effort to make sure that its folks, its personnel, have been able to thrive, not just survive in very challenging times, but thrive by in this instance, coming to Toronto and coming to other parts of Canada. A number of folks from Ukraine, I understand, also moved to Poland. There's an office in Poland, and some of them actually came as well to Montreal. But a good number of former residents of Ukraine are now based in the Toronto office. And the Toronto office itself is, I think, I should know this by now. I don't know the exact number, but it's around 45, 50 people. It's a very significant footprint in Ontario. When the office opened, Doug Downey and Vic Fideli and others, I think, celebrated the opening. It was a pretty big milestone for another company, a Canadian company, to enhance the economic impacts of the online gaming universe here in Ontario and in Toronto by opening up this office. And so, yeah, no, it's no coincidence that I would point to GeoComply as a real success story, not just from a gaming perspective, but also as one that helps drive jobs, innovation, and all the economic spin-offs that result from that.
Yeah, and we know, Ilkim, that GeoComply has also been a loud voice at the table for expanded regulated gambling. And at that office opening, I think 2 years ago, Lindsay Slater spoke about pushing for regulated gambling to be expanded in Quebec, and for Quebec to look at the Ontario model and follow that. We see what's going on in Alberta right now, and what looks to be a road to regulation there, and in the U.S. as well. We see more U.S. states trying to legalize online sports betting. We talk frequently on this podcast about the efforts to expand legal iGaming into different states across the U.S. For your new role with GeoComply, kind of what's at the top of your to-do list right now?
The to-do list is a big list, as you can appreciate. First, I got to get my arms around everything that GeoComply is involved in and wants to be involved in. But frankly, one of the reasons, again, I joined GeoComply is that we're so aligned on why GeoComply exists and why the gaming industry exists and why it should continue to expand in many ways in the first place. And that is the integrity of gaming. And GeoComply's very DNA is about making sure that that gaming is done above board and in compliance with all applicable regulations and laws, and from an ethical perspective, regulated perspective. The conversation isn't much different than the kinds of things that I've been advocating for and others had been advocating for before Ontario transitioned into what we have today with the iGo reality, the open licensing model. That is, you have a lot of consumer expectations in the world these days, especially given the rapid change of technology and the access to mobile devices and gaming across the planet. And unregulated gaming has existed for a long time, not just in one jurisdiction, but all over the planet. And it's a tremendous opportunity if one chooses to take that opportunity from a public policy perspective to protect the residents of the relevant jurisdiction. And using Ontario as an example, of course, in Ontario, the idea was Ontario had a very robust gray and or black market for a long, long time. And regulation sets the foundation for integrity around not just the more obvious things like will you get paid if you actually participate in this gaming exercise, but also responsible gaming and making sure that all the right things are being done from the perspective of keeping unacceptable, unsuitable actors out of the jurisdiction, making sure you're in line with public policy expectations in the jurisdiction that we happen to be discussing. So regulated gaming ultimately leading to channelization of that activity that's already happening, that is already very robust, to a reality where funds are being generated that can be used for the public good to prioritize public policy. And that could be anything. It could be gaming related from a perspective of, for example, responsible gaming, to dedicated funds for other things. It could be infrastructure, it could be technology, it could be innovation, but channelizing the existing unregulated activity to a regulated activity to generate funds for the public good, it is really the reason why gaming continues to, I think, make sense in so many jurisdictions and continues to, I think, robustly grow in one shape or another. Of course, the debate always goes back to, does it make sense for the jurisdiction that we're talking about? Every jurisdiction is a little unique, but the philosophy of regulation versus non-regulation, I think is a tremendous one, and GeoComply and I are very much on the same page on that.
Hey, gaming news guys! Are you ready to win a bigger share of Canada's rapidly expanding gaming market? Then GBG are ready to help. As the global leaders in identity verification, GBG partner with over 60% of iGaming Ontario brands to help them onboard more players, maximize match rates, and deliver FinTrack compliance. Visit gbgplc.com today and talk to the trust experts. Ilkim, you've had several, I guess I'll call them, unique views of this industry over the last 20 years. I think you mentioned, starting out as a general counsel at Casino-Rama back in the day, and also the work you did as general counsel and corporate secretary at the British Columbia Lottery Corporation. You've been involved in gaming practices for a couple of the biggest law firms in Canada. 3 years as executive vice president and chief legal officer for Hard Rock International around the same time that we started Gaming News Canada. In that 20 years, like what have been the biggest changes to the industry, and kind of how have your thoughts shifted around the gambling industry at large?
Excellent question, sir. When I started at BCLC, I didn't really know what gaming was. And this was 21 years ago. I learned very quickly how the conduct and manage model in Canada works, of course, being the general counsel of one of those conductors and managers, BC Lottery Corporation. And before that, I had spent a few years as in-house counsel at another Canadian success story, IMAX Corporation. We've all seen IMAX movies, of course, and what some folks may not realize is that's another Canadian success story. But that combined with my BCLC experience, let me see how big, giant, entertainment-focused, consumer-focused, entertainment adjacent industries function in Canada. Certainly in British Columbia, again, as the conductor and manager, BCLC had the mandate to make sure everything was being done properly in that jurisdiction. But as I moved from BCLC back to Ontario to work for Penn National Gaming, I also saw how the private sector developers and operators really see not just Canada, but the world. Of course, Penn National Gaming has continued to grow since those days. That was from about 2008 to 2013. And Casino-Rama, being also on First Nations land, the Chippewas of Rama First Nation were the host community, and they still continue to be, of course, the host community. That added a tremendous perspective to what I saw in the gaming space. As a side note, that property also had the highest number of First Nations and Indigenous employees at any single site in Canada, and that was a tremendous boon for a lot of communities that wouldn't otherwise have benefited from that gaming activity, and that was fantastic to see. So I learned how that worked, and of course I saw how a U.S. company based in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, saw Canada and how the Canadian operations integrated with the U.S. Then after that, I spent a few years with Onyx Corporation, one of Canada's preeminent private equity firms deploying capital in the gaming industry. That let me see how that perspective views gaming, the investment community, the financing community, and that was also very fascinating, and it let me see angles that I hadn't seen before. I'd sat on the opposite side of the table from private equity companies. Now I was one of them, and that was also tremendous learnings for me. That was also a great experience from many perspectives. And then the law firms, of course, opened up the door to a lot of relationships with a lot of clients in many verticals. The online vertical, of course, and OLG at the time in Ontario was undergoing the modernization initiative, and a lot of US and global companies were interested in Ontario. And then after that, Hard Rock and I, who happened to be one of my good clients, convinced me to give up the comforts of my beloved Toronto and move down to South Florida, just outside of Miami, right before the pandemic with 2 newborns. So the timing, in retrospect, wasn't amazing. Who could have predicted the pandemic? But and of course, Hard Rock being a tremendous global brand that is it spans over 70 countries, that has a huge footprint, not just in entertainment in the gaming sense, but also live music, hospitality, F&B, the restaurants. Truly an omni-channel entity. And the brand, a tremendous brand, obviously, that's been around for 50 years. It allowed me to see that perspective in the middle of the pandemic, being a Canadian in South Florida and being the chair of the CGA, trying to advocate for the reopening of facilities in Canada, and also meeting my obligations as CLO of a giant, behemoth of an organization. Let me see a lot of interesting perspectives that I wouldn't have before. So all that to say, Steve, I've seen a lot, everything. I said before about the only constant being change still applies to this day in my mind. I can't predict whether 5 years from now, even laptop computers will exist the way they do today in the form they do today. So that's really hard to predict given the pace with which technology changes. But at the same time, what I continue to see is there's an inherent desire to make sure the industry, the integrity of the industry is protected. The underlying stakeholders who are really the players, ultimately the folks who are participating and folks who feel the impacts, good and bad, of the gaming industry. Those folks are protected, and how innovation is embraced, and how ultimately making sure that we move in the right direction through either consensus building or the art of the possible. Ultimately, I believe those trends will continue. Again, we will continue to seek innovation. We will continue to seek making sure we protect the vulnerable, that we protect the industry's very integrity. And if you stick to those compasses as your guides, then I think you can help make sure the industry evolves in the right direction.
Your chairpersonship of the Canadian Gaming Association ended in January, and your term aligns pretty much with the opening of the Ontario market, and again, the industry, I think we both would agree, has gone through a crazy 3 years. We're a month away from Ontario recognizing its third anniversary of its regulated marketplace. Has the mandate for the CGA changed much, Ilkim, over that 3 years? I mean, maybe like where did it start? Where you took over the chair role, and where was it when you left?
Well, Steve, when I took over, I had been on the board for 3 years prior to that, but not in the chair capacity. Kerry Cormos had been a prior chair, and Kerry probably is no stranger to most of your listeners as well, with Gateway. And she had, I think, ushered in a new era, working very closely, obviously, with Paul Burns to, I think, evolve the CGA itself into a more, call it, more robust and capable organization than perhaps it had been in the past. And ultimately, the timing was again impacted quite a bit by the pandemic. It changed our approach to everything, as we can all remember, and not too long ago. But ultimately, working together with the right stakeholders has always been part of the CGA's very mandate. It's about communication, it's about collaboration, it's about education, it's about ensuring um, that the right information, correct, objective information, data-driven, data-based, scientific information is the basis for action, for decision making. There are a lot of sources of information, as we can all appreciate, out there. Some of them are maybe a little less reliable than others. And one of the things that the CGA has had on its mandate to do is be that source of truth, that source of correct, objective information. And although, you know, I don't think we've been perhaps as successful as aspirational as we wanted to be in terms of being a repository of that correct source of information, source of truth. I think we've made a lot of strides in that space. I think our membership has continued to evolve because of the online reality to a great extent. Obviously, bricks and mortars gaming has been around in Canada for a lot longer than online gaming, interactive gaming. Some of your listeners may not be aware that responsible gaming initiatives, for example, and AML initiatives and other public policy driven and regulatory requirements have been in place in Canada for many years, for decades, a lot longer than some jurisdictions. And some of that is directly applicable to the online space, and some of it is not. It has to be customizable, of course. But ultimately, the membership is going to also drive the mandate of the CGA. And while embracing the very core foundational pillars of why the CGA exists in the first place, to help essentially advance the evolution of gaming through collaboration and advocacy and education. The membership's change has necessitated a different way of thinking of certain things. And so you'll find a mix of membership now that wouldn't have existed 10 years ago, even probably 5 years ago. And I think that's a good thing. And I'd be shocked if that didn't keep on evolving over time as other things happen in the industry. So ultimately, I think the CGA has done some tremendous things in terms of educating folks that I think maybe haven't had that ability to tap into that source of truth, and also advocating for regulated gaming that's been consistent, and advocating for collaboration. One of the things that sometimes would be frustrating to me, and I think to all of us, would be when opportunities for collaboration would disappear or would be diminished for one reason or another, and then ultimately certain decisions would be made in a vacuum as opposed to through informed decision making with the experts in the room. And CGA, I think, has done a really good job of getting experts in the room and providing that source of information for a lot of decision makers in this space.
You know, I think a lot of us that cover the industry in Canada, Ilkim, we've been fairly critical, I think, at times of, you know, it feels like Paul Burns is too often the voice of the industry, and that's not meant as a slight against Paul. I mean, I think the industry is lucky to have someone like Paul, who's been like you've been in the industry for more than 20 years, knows the industry really, really well, is an eloquent spokesperson for the industry. But it feels at times that, you know, the alcohol in Ontario, for example, the AGCO hasn't been allowed enough voice as an advocate for regulated gambling. I think, you know, when I talk to other people who cover the industry, there's a feeling that iGaming Ontario needs to be a louder voice. I've made the case in the newsletter and on this podcast. I think there are operators who could be a louder voice supporting what Paul and people like yourself and Amanda Brewer have to do, speaking on behalf of the industry. Is that a fair criticism? I also wonder if it's a case where, because in Ontario, three years, I mean, it's still, I guess you can make the case that it's still an industry in its infancy. And do you see an evolution where maybe we are going to see more voices come out, and you know, Paul isn't that what it feels like sometimes, that man alone on an island?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if Paul has cloned himself and is in 10 places at the same time. He's a busy guy. Very good question. One of the things that is different in Canada, obviously compared to the U.S., is just the model that we have in terms of the conductor and manager dynamic and the regulator being there alongside the conductor and manager based on the requirements of the criminal code. And ultimately, you have multiple stakeholders in gaming, and the private sector being one significant stakeholder, of course. And you have a lot of different opinions and divergent, in some cases, opinions, and a lot of room for consensus building as well. But what happens, what I find, and when I was working at HRI in South Florida, I was able to step back a little bit and compare and contrast Canada to the US and other parts of the world. And certainly, tribal gaming is also a very robust part of the landscape in the US, and it's a little different than how it's done here. So that's a related but separate topic as well. I think it's really difficult for some stakeholders to be able to be as loud as they would like, just given the very nature of the architecture. I think the Canadian reality is a very complicated ecosystem. It's not also necessarily uniform across the country. BC may have a Crown conductor and manager in BCLC, my former employer, and Ontario may have a conductor and manager at OLG. But they exist in different universes, on different coasts, obviously. But they have different mandates. The provinces have different priorities. Each provincial ministry that's responsible for those crown corps and for the regulators like GPEB in BC and AGCO in Ontario, for example, and this applies across the entire country, really have reason to celebrate commonalities, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that one size fits all solution just doesn't come naturally, and it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. So if one entity was to be certainly raise their voice about a topic, that voice may make a ton of sense within their own jurisdiction, but it may not be 100% or really well applicable to another jurisdiction. So that's a complication that I find informs why some folks or some organizations perhaps are maybe louder advocates than others. But at the same time, there's also a ton of what I would call behind the scenes conversations that happen as one would expect, as in any industry. And I'm very heartened by a lot of champions in various circles, be they crown corps, be they government, be they regulators, be they private sector, folks who understand the industry, or folks who want to understand the industry, folks who want to embrace the very concept of integrity of gaming and the value that the industry really presents to the fabric of Canadiana in terms of the economic engine that it is. It's a massive multi-billion-dollar engine that is responsible for the generation of so many jobs, so many technological advancements and innovations. So look at GeoComply as an example, for example, that a lot of folks who may not be on the public stage, perhaps being as loud as one might think they ought to be, a lot of those folks are having serious conversations about the very fabric of the gaming industry and how it makes sense across the board generally, or how it makes sense in their jurisdiction. So I share the sentiment. Sometimes I want to raise my hand and yell and scream and say, hey, can you say a little more about this thing, or can you be the champion? Can you advocate for this and that? And it's a very complicated ecosystem, and it's really hard to say, why certain folks do certain things until you know exactly what the nuances are. And ultimately, the belief that I have is if you wrap yourself in this concept and the very DNA of the integrity of gaming and the protection of the folks that participate in this industry and the residents of your jurisdiction, then you can't go wrong. And I think a lot of folks do advocate, but maybe behind closed doors.
Hey, how would you evaluate the Ontario model, Ilkim, as we get ready to recognize 3 years of existence?
Well, first of all, I think Ontario did a tremendous job as being a leader in this space and embraced innovation, embraced the inevitability of technological change, embraced what consumer expectations were and are, and launched what we see now. And so kudos to all the political and other champions and the private sector and the regulator, AGCO, and others who advocated for this. And I think that was tremendous. And secondly, the numbers, I think, sort of speak for themselves. IGO releases numbers regularly. I think you on this podcast have reported on that. And I think January was a record month just very recently. I believe the year 5 projections have already been hit from a economic perspective. I think it's a tremendous success. At the same time, I hear some folks, rightly so in some cases, perhaps less rightly so if you consider it more holistically, complain about certain aspects of this. And I find myself reminding certain folks that perfection isn't what we strived for when we launched this back a few years ago, and as you noted, the 3rd anniversary is around the corner, and we have to evolve. And we are at a place where by almost every metric that matters, including channelization of the gray market and therefore protection of the folks that are in Ontario, the residents of Ontario, it's a tremendous success. We're abutting 90% channelization rates, and I think it's only going to get higher. Can certain things be improved? Can certain things be better? Absolutely. Show me an industry where that's not the case. But by traditional metrics and what we thought would happen, it's a huge success, and kudos to all the folks involved. And it needs to improve in certain things, and the devil's in the details, and some aspects of it are daily operational challenges that need to really turn into efficiencies and embracing of technology and innovation and better ways of actually protecting the public. But we'll get there. I have every confidence that we'll get there, certainly in Ontario, and I'm confident that the rest of the provinces will see the benefits of that as well.
Yeah, that was my next question, Malcolm. I mean, do you see a day where, and again, we know about, there's the clash of coalitions right now, and a lot going on in the background about taking the Ontario model or just expanded legal gambling in other provinces. Do you see that day where we will see across the board competitive regimes like Ontario and in every province across Canada?
Across the board is the complicated piece of that. Will that happen one day? Absolutely, it'll happen one day. I don't know what the timetable for that is. Will it happen in multiple jurisdictions, multiple provinces and territories? 100%. It's inevitable. Ultimately, again, the philosophy being the same. This isn't about expanded gaming. This is about expanded protection of your residents and expanded innovation and expanded correct way of doing things from a public policy perspective, and a better way of making sure industry, innovation, and ultimately the protection of the priorities of those jurisdictions are realized. But a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't exist. And so I think it'll be staggered. Alberta obviously has, under Minister Nally and others, has expressed, and obviously it's not just an aspirational expression, they've said they are going to launch as of, I think, today we don't know exactly when that will be, but it will be not in the too distant future. And then I suspect other provinces will do the same. Will it be a unified approach across the country? Will it be happening all at once? It certainly won't be happening all at once, and it probably won't be a unified approach. But at the same time, there's so many synergies, so many opportunities to not waste time, money, energy in so many ways that collaboration and comparing notes and ultimately not reinventing the wheel is probably a path to success.
Hey, just a couple more questions, Ilkim. I do want you to put your legal counsel cap on for a second. Just, I think we've seen not just hints, but signs over the past 6-7 months in the U.S. where there have been a couple of federal bills proposed around the gambling industry, and the federal government wanting to get involved in. In Canada, we have the same type of situation where the provinces, for the most part, operate, conduct as managed, as you put it. Is there a sweet spot for federal and provincial oversight to work in concert together, or is what we have in Canada right now, is that a working model moving forward, and maybe there just needs to be some tweaks made?
That's a very, very complicated question, Steve. It's interesting what's happening today, certainly in the U.S. and in Canada. In the U.S., there's a lot of conversation around the CFTC, of course, the prediction markets. In Canada, the bills you've mentioned as well. It's very jurisdiction specific. It's really hard to compare the U.S. and Canada on this. In Canada, having the criminal code essentially a very small portion of the criminal code be the foundation of the law, the underpinning of the law that ultimately resides, the power ultimately to run gaming and to be accountable for gaming ultimately being in the hands of the provinces. I mean, that stems from federal law. Basically, there's a whole history beyond what's sort of obvious on the page that I may or may not have written a number of legal opinions on over the years. As we sort of know, in Canada, the federal government left the jurisdiction essentially to the provinces, and the provinces are responsible. And is there a path to the criminal code being amended in Canada? There's always a path for that, but it's not as simple as that. The provinces have spent a lot of time and energy, infrastructure, creating the regulated realities that we find now. And again, I go back to the very foundational reasons as to why the industry can be and should be successful: the protection of the people in the various provinces and the jurisdictions. A lot of effort has gone into figuring out what that means from an RG perspective, AML perspective, and other perspectives in Ontario, in Alberta, in BC, and all the provinces and territories, and the Atlantic provinces, of course, as well, everywhere, Quebec. It doesn't make sense in my mind to just overnight say, hey, there should be some kind of federal involvement in that doesn't coexist in a harmonious way with the provincial reality. And I don't think it'll ever turn into that. And in the U.S. as well, again, it's very complicated. But at the same time, I think even the Supreme Court of the United States itself has recognized the power of the states themselves. The states themselves have spent a lot of time, energy, and figuring out how to regulate gaming within the states themselves. And if there's going to be anything that is above and beyond that, it really makes sense to me to harmonize that with how that's done at the state level, and ultimately benefit not just the economic engine that gaming can help be, but also how do you protect the industry, the integrity of the industry, and the people within those jurisdictions in harmonious cooperation with the states. Finding that sweet mix, that sweet spot of mix, I think is very, very complicated, and public policy shifts every day, as we've seen recently as well. So don't know what that's gonna look like in a few years. But if we stick to first principles, I think, and if we really work towards not stifling innovation too, and that's the flip side. Once upon a time, not that long ago, sports betting itself was the gray market or the black market. You couldn't play online. Everyone involved in that was looked at a little funny, because the law was not certain. Uncertainty is a vacuum that creates a lot of unpredictable behavior, and that's not good for anyone. So what I would advocate for is trying to get the right experts around the table, objective, scientific, data-driven conversations to help the decision makers make the right decisions without stifling innovation, with the primary goal being, let's protect the people we're supposed to protect, and let's generate funds for public policy priorities. I know I sort of sounded a little bit like a politician there, but it was half inadvertent.
Hey, final question. Listen, the last 5 years has been, I think, a roller coaster ride for all of us. I mean, it's a pandemic, but again, look at you, and father of twins, and several job changes, and that's certainly not unique in my life. The twins part is, but that job changes, but you look, we're working for HRI, chairing the Canadian Gaming Association, chairing the gaming practice at Fogler, Rubinoff LLP, and now GeoComply. What's the most exciting challenge, or what is it that you're excited about with this new job with GeoComply?
Well, that's a pretty easy one. I love the technology and innovation side of what GeoComply does. I mean, GeoComply is a technology company and a gaming company, and a company that pushes the evolution of the industry itself through technological solutions. And the very DNA of the company, as I say to folks who ask me similar questions, is the integrity of gaming from a technological perspective that one wouldn't have thought of 10, 15, 20 years ago. These technologies didn't exist back then. And when I first started my first in-house role at IMAX, when I was an impressionable young lawyer a lifetime ago, in the late 1990s, early 2000s now, I loved learning about the technology of the rolling loop projector that the IMAX founders had built, which to this day I think is the best film-based technology ever made. But now, I see what Anna, David, and the whole team at GeoComply have done, and what they have in the hopper, and the future is very, very bright. I think for those who embrace technology, for those who embrace innovation, for those who embrace doing the right thing, because doing the right thing is the path to success. And I'm very excited to learn more about the technology. I'm very excited to be part of an iterative process where the next thing is better than the last thing, and where I can actually, look someone straight in the eye and say, hey, I'm doing this from an integrity perspective. Like, what we do makes the internet safer. What we do makes your life better, makes your life easier and safer. And that applies not just in gaming, across the board. Anti-fraud in this digitized age is fantastically important, no matter how you slice it, no matter what industry you're in. And now I'm on the inside of one of the most innovative companies, frankly, in the world. And I can't wait to learn it and in greater detail, and pretend to be a bit of an engineer, hopefully, and speak a little more intelligently about the technology, and also wave that flag of innovation, collaboration, and embracing all of the above.
Ilkim Hincer is the former chair of the Canadian Gaming Association, the new chief legal officer at GeoComply. Hey, Ilkim, this was terrific. I feel even worse now that it took you so long to get on the podcast, having had this conversation with you. But as we say, better late than never. And we're going to hold you to not waiting too long before we get you back on the podcast again.
Sounds great, Steve. No, I appreciate that, and I'll definitely be back be it based here in Toronto, Vancouver, or wherever else it may be. But I'm never far away.
Great. Thanks, Ilkim. That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show presented by GBG Plc. As always, you can find this podcast at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thanks so much again to Ilkim Hincer for joining us today, and we will see everybody again very soon.